both.
Gee, wow.
Gee, wow. Thank you, lady. Thank you for that. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Roger Johnson. I'm the CCS's London programme organiser, and I'd like to welcome everybody, both online and in the room, to today's presentation. And a particular welcome to John Carrington, who is our speaker. The topic for today is the mobile revolution, the early days of cellular, 1983 to 93, a personal view. And John was very much at the heart of the developments in that period. He was with the Post Office and with BT, and he became managing director of BT's Cellular project in May 1983. And that will no doubt be the starting point of this afternoon's talk. And that company would then launch the service as Cellnet in January 1985. And John will tell us the story of how that whole company developed. And sorry, Bill. We will, let me at this point hand over to John, invite John to give us his talk. I will now share the screen on this machine.
After you've clicked on, got it.
Oh.
You need to get it, I think.
Yes, it's up there.
This is the screen that's being.
Apologies to those of you not in the room, trying to.
Just press enter and it'll go away.
Press enter just.
It's not that other one on this desk that's fiddling about, is it? Yeah.
Ah, yes.
Yes, it's that one.
Has it gone?
The mouse is moving.
Right.
It's gone, John. Bill, sorry.
Right. Yes.
We'll edit.
Very good. Okay, so I'll share.
Sure.
We've got the shared screen on Zoom now.
Thanks, Terry.
Thank you, Terry. John, apologies for the slight perturbations there. We'll see whether we can edit the recording. John, over to you.
Thanks, Roger, very much. Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this afternoon, both physically and virtually. Now, my talk today is really a personal view of I think one of the most exciting developments in communications, the advent of mass mobile communications. I will outline in this talk the developments of the technology and markets in the UK from 1983 until 1993, covering first and second generation networks. And of course, we're on to generation 4. Elements of generation 5 are coming up now. That's how it's grown in the last, as we said, in the last 40 years. May 83 starts the first license was issued in March 83, and the second one in May 83 when I became involved. I will also offer my own perspectives on the various threads of technology and politics, and the way in which they influence what happened. Now, in some areas, I'm not able to go into considerable detail. This is a bit of a sweep. But I think the last 40 years with Cellular has shown a great exemplar of Moore's law being delivered, fantastic integration chips, which led from that to that in 10 years. That's one of the last old analog systems. Even the first digital systems were still quite big. So that's the first GSM that I ever had in 1992, I think. And that came out just a couple of years later. So that's what we're talking about, what you can do with computing. It's also about mass market manufacturing, what you do if you go from being able to address a small market to a large market and the economies that you can get from that. And there's also, I think, an example of what you can do when you cooperate internationally, both in terms of technology, in terms of standards, in terms of radio frequency allocation, and politically. And that's what this story, I think, demonstrates. Now, mobile before cellular. Do I need to use this one?
Sorry, is it not moving? Worked earlier.
Sorry about this. We have the technology here.
It's the British Computer Society. We should know by now it doesn't work.
Somebody's fiddled in the last 5 minutes.
New version, it used to.
I think Zoom's gone to sleep somewhere in the stack.
There's a mouse on the screen. So.
I mean, I could press on, but I think what's important is some of the pictures, and the next picture actually is important in terms of understanding the history. So I will.
As long as we get a nice little pause before the next image comes up, then that will give me a space in which to edit it out.
I think you've got a nice big space here.
Well, it'll be at least 1/25th of a second.
Well, asking a question before you answered it. Were you based on Bath Road in Slough?
No, that was before that time. We started off in Euston Tower.
Oh, yeah.
Which was BT solicitors had moved out and they had some space they didn't know what to do with. So they put us up there on the 30th floor. We then had our own offices just north of the city, which was where the first switch was. And then later, obviously, as it grew, various other switch locations happened and the headquarters was moved to Slough.
Okay.
We can't move the slides.
It's not moving, yeah.
There we go.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So phones in cars had actually been around for almost 40 years by the time my story starts. They were bulky until the advent of the BT System 4, which was interesting, had a push to talk button. So if you wanted to talk, they were unidirectional. They were like the things you'd see on boats or planes. The user had to say over. And even with System 4, which was the system that came in and allowed you to direct dial and have a two-way talk, just like an ordinary telephone, I was saying to Roger before the meeting, you had to know where the person you were calling was, because there were different numbers or different allocations, prefixes, depending on if you're in Manchester or Birmingham or London or in Brighton. The system couldn't track where you were. You had to tell somebody, I'm going to Brighton. If you want me in my car, you call this number and then my number. So that's where we were 40 years ago. In 1983, they were limited in number and range by the technology and available frequencies. Demand was always, however, outstripped supply. So even with those rather cumbersome phones, there was a strong black market for phones in cars, and they were between £3,000 and £4,000 a time. You couldn't get enough. This is a reminder, this is a slide I referred to earlier, of what things were like in the heady days of System 3. The good thing was you got good coverage, and in fact we didn't take System 3 out of service until the end of the 1980s because there was excellent coverage in Scotland. So why is cellular so important? The secret, as I'm sure most of you know, is in frequency reuse, enabled by the computer technology that came about that didn't allow System 4 to know where you were in the country automatically. So for example, with the pre-cellular systems, you could only reuse the frequencies over quite long distances. So for example, if you were using frequencies in London, they couldn't be reused until Birmingham. Such was the power of the output, the fact that technology was not up to using smaller cells than that. And we've come a long way since then, such that the slide that I have got here shows you that, for example, if the yellow was London, and the green would be Birmingham, the grey would be Newcastle, and so on and so forth. Today, we're talking about the yellow being here, the green being next door, or in the foyer, the blue being in the room next door there. Such is the distance that we've come in the last 40 years to allow us to deal with the capacity which is needed to the fact that you've all got mobile telephones in your pockets, probably some of them one or two. Now, the origins of cellular. It started really with Bell Labs in the 1960s. The invention of the transistor and the microprocessor allowed the complex task of tracking the mobile to take place, which you couldn't do before. However, it wasn't until the 1980s that the US regulatory process via the Federal Communications Commission allowed commercial operations with 2 operators in each city region allocated via competitive tender. It's interesting that this often has taken place in US developments of technology. The Federal Communications Commission, for those who don't know, is a judicial body. And it can take, well, as you see here, years from pleading to do things, to get it through that body. So the technology oftentimes has been in advance of the ability to adopt it commercially. Trials were opened in Chicago and Washington, Baltimore, one by Motorola and the other one by AT&T in 1983. They operated at 800 megahertz, which were the frequencies that had been allocated for mobile. Meanwhile, during this regulatory process, others had entered the market, especially the very successful Pan-Nordic system, which opened in 1981. That used 450 megahertz, which allows you to see further. And it's quite advantageous in areas with thinly populated, that are thinly populated. Now, in the UK, Margaret Thatcher's government promoted competition in telecommunications, where with Sir Keith Joseph, who was the author of a lot of the policies at that time for the Tories, heading the Department of Trade and Industry. They started, of course, with BT itself, as it became, Post Office Telecommunications, with competition there with Mercury. And in 1982, the government announced that there would be 2 operators for cellular, with separate resellers providing services and mobiles to end customers. So in fact, what they said was the network itself, the networks, there will be 2. They will not supply mobiles directly to customers. They will have to go through third parties who will have to be licensed resellers. Now, this approach is designed to boost competition and involve more businesses in the markets, as to have had more than 2 network operators would have greatly diminished capacity. Every time you split frequencies between operators, you greatly reduce the capacity of the network to handle the number of customers. Frequencies at the 900 megahertz range were freed up from both the military and the old 405 line broadcasting channels, which, as you know, were replaced by 625 when colour came in. There was also, intriguingly, a small set of frequencies which were used by security devices in shops, which we had to put a working party together to deal with, because otherwise, every time you went into a shop with one of these, you would have set the alarm off with your mobile. And the newly created regulator, Oftel, would judge competitive bids for licenses. The UK bidding process. BT was not guaranteed a license, although it would like one. It had been planning a new system involving cellular, which of course was going to be imaginatively called System 5. The government insisted BT had to find a partner in order to bid for a license. And Securicor emerged as a partner in a 40% share of the proposed operating company, which became immeasurably known as Telecom Securicor Cellular Radio. So why Securicor? Well, as most of you know, they were noted for carrying large, secure, mainly money between banks and offices and retail outlets. Well, one of their diversifications from their security carriage business had been selling and installing pre-cellular mobiles, like the one you saw before. They also had an extensive private mobile network, which they needed for their own security within their vans, but they also made that available to third parties. A second license was awarded to a joint venture between Racal, Millicom, and Hambros in March 1983. That's where I come into the picture. I was appointed to establish and lead the BT Securicor joint venture in May 1983, which was the month when our license was issued. The UK cellular standard then. The UK was driven by government industrial policy to help UK industry with opportunities for exports. Things were tight. A great deal of resource from BT Research in Martlesham, in Suffolk, the DTI, Racal and BT joint ventures was applied to the work. The standard emerged was actually, shortcut, was based on the US AMP system that had been developed by to serve their cellular market, American Mobile Phone System. And it emerged really only just in time for manufacturers to meet the deadline for service, which was, according to the license, had to start in January or the beginning of 1985, I think by March 1985. A key decision was that the calling party would pay. I don't know if you even remember this, because in the States, I don't know if it's still so today, if you called a mobile, a cellular mobile, the person you were calling actually paid the bill. So we felt that by doing that, some people would not accept calls, and that was the case in the States. And it did help to, well, it slowed down the take-up of mobiles there.
Isn't that how the post started? You could send a letter, and you could, if you didn't receive it.
That was before the penny post, yes. Yes, in the entire, you had to pay as a receiver. That's why it exploded in May 1840, wasn't it? The standard was sufficiently important for government, for the Secretary of State, who was then Norman Tebbit, to sign the document launching it. And this is the facing page, which tells people about the new British UK telecoms access system. Now, the market. We were entering really uncharted waters. The market forecasts at that time do reflect that. This is something we did in March 1984 for Telecom Securicor Cellular Radio. And it's actually very conservative with the benefit of hindsight. But what it's difficult to remember is just how skeptical the public were, well, the public as represented by the media and the city. They could not see an explosion in this area. There weren't enough other markets to test it. I'll come back to our forecasts later on. On the supply side, as I said, the key terms of the network provision were to encourage competition following the US example. And there were 2 operators, each with 25-year licenses. There were strict coverage targets, and the networks had to sell through third parties. The chosen network manufacturers were Thorn Ericsson for Racal and Motorola for Telecom Securicor Cellular Radio. So there we are in 1983, beginning of 1984, working on the standard, beginning to plan the networks, which was then done with OS maps and tracing paper in order to get the ability to be able to do frequency reuse. And 1984 actually proved a key year for understanding the potential of mobile. The Nordic and US networks had actually proved successful. But we still had very little idea of what the UK demand would be. An opportunity to put a toe in the demand water arose when Telecom Securicor Cellular Radio, we took up a challenge to provide a pilot network for the G7 summit in June 1984. What we did was we put up 6 overlapping cells covering central London, Gatwick, which is where President Reagan and others would come in, and the roads in between, A23, London, Gatwick and A23. Now, the tax standard wasn't finally ready by June 1984, and so for the manufacturers, and so we used modified AMPS system applied to the Telecom Securicor frequencies. And the test of the technology and the UK customer intent, the pilot network actually was a great success. I chose the time to have our first ad in the Financial Times, and this is it, featuring Ronald Reagan, who was at that summit. And as it probably says, being out of the office needn't be the end of the world. And we launched the name Cellnet and the brand. Actually, using the president was sailing close to the wind, and well, I got my collar felt, but the embassy liked it, and I think other people beyond it liked it, and they asked for copies. So we breathed a sigh of relief. What was interesting was from that one advert in the Financial Times, which you had to clip out, we got 15,000 responses. After the summit, we had permission to keep the system up for about 2 or 3 weeks. And we fitted out a coach with phones, and we had a number of the hand portables, the Motorola ones, 10 Motorola Dynatacs. And I spent a lot of time with potential customers. The key thing for me is everyone who used one wanted one. So that was a signal for me to ask funders for more money for the network, which I got. We were able finally to show what the pent-up demand looked like. I also realized that BT, despite its huge network, did lack the necessary project management skills to provide a network in the time required. Remember, this is June 84. We had to have the system up by March 85. So the suggestion was made and I jumped at it. We brought in W.S. Atkins to help us with the project planning. And if you don't know W.S. Atkins, they're the people who do nuclear power stations and motorways, probably somewhere deeply involved in HS1 and HS2. And that really made a huge difference to our ability to put up the network. Cellnet and Motorola's unique position in the supply of handheld phones to build the worst allowed us to build the first network in the world, which was designed to support hand portables, like this one. This is not a Motorola one, rather than phones in cars. You need more cells because the frequency, the power in that has to be limited. Otherwise, it's microwave. You could, it could cause problems. So the power output from that has to be matched by a nearer cell. And it seems rather strange today, as I say, that we're probably surrounded by cells here, but that wasn't the case 40 years ago, obviously. At £3,300, that's what we sold them for. We couldn't get enough of the Motorola handsets when we launched. And this was the beast. This was the one that we launched service with, and was a very good piece of equipment. Cellnet tried to launch actually ahead of the game on Christmas Day 1984 on the Noel Edmonds show. Like Calais, it's engraved on my heart. But sadly, one of our guys who was out in the field forgot to press the end button on the Dynatac that he was using. And Noel Edmonds, who was sitting there with my chairman in the post office tower, could only get the engaged tone when he called Johnny Morris, who was in Regent's Park. So, does he have luck? Remember what Napoleon said. So the first commercial call was actually claimed by Rocal on the 1st of January 1985. Demand thereafter, fantastic. So this was the coverage at launch in the early part of 1986 that was picked up by the New Scientist in 1985. The networks did spread fast to meet the coverage conditions and the licenses. We opened in Birmingham and on the motorway to London, and we were serving out towards Dover and into East Anglia. Don't ask me why East Anglia, probably because I lived there. However, this was something that was said to me fairly early on in the piece. The fast UK coverage soon raised questions from customers about international connectivity. They liked the beast so much because there was none. A pan-European standard had been under discussion since 1982 in a group called GSM, which is what the standard's now called. In those days, it was the Groupe Spéciale Mobile and was part of a pan-European network of largely monopolies called SEPT, which represented both telecoms and posts. and was actually quite good at developing standards, but it took a long time. And really, it was bogged down by national industrial policies. I started to explore cooperation in Europe early on, and I visited Paris in February 1986 to meet my opposite numbers from France and Germany. I let the DTI know beforehand that I was going, and I had quite a strong note from them saying, agree nothing. What they didn't want to do was undermine the potential of tax as an international export opportunity. I had another role soon after the launch of Cellnet. I had it before that, but I didn't take it up. I was director of mobile by then at BT. And I was convinced that the future of mobile was tied up with an international agreement on standards. My experience in BT International, which is where I'd been before, had shown how potent agreement on standards could be as a stimulant to growth in telecommunications. During my time in BT International, we introduced direct dialing for people internationally. And if you look at the graphs, I mean, the demand just went off the scale. You didn't have to go through an operator. And that was about agreeing standards. The success of the new cellular networks and the fact that continental industrial interests could dominate a pan-European standard did actually cause a review to take place in the DTI. And I do think my lobbying helped a bit there. All of that anon. 1985 saw a rapid growth in the market, stimulated not just by meeting pent-up demand, but also by actions by Cellnet and Racal aimed at taking competitive advantage. So that a year later, after launch, BT cut the price of its cheapest car phone by 50% and bundled the phone with the rental, which is what happens today. So that's still. However, all this success had a cost. High demand stressed both the networks, especially Cellnet, where the Motorola exchanges, which were actually designed for US city regions, proved to be too small. There was a plan to introduce 5 times the size switches, computers, but they were late. For Cellnet, the stress on the switches caused them to shut down. They're just like any other computer. They gave up, reinitialized, and started up again, which was wonderful for the computer, but didn't do much for the customers who were left out there without a service. Racal had a similar problem, but they had larger switches from Ericsson. Their problem was at the margins of the areas covered by cells where you would drop out. That's not quite as serious. And we did lose market share. So the loss of market share caused a network outage. Let me suggest to Motorola that they should partner with somebody else we worked with elsewhere, which was Siemens, who by then didn't have they had a mobile operation, but it was still in the old pre-cellular system that was operating in Germany. But they had a large digital exchanges capable of meeting demand. Motorola and Siemens did become partners in 1986, and the bigger switches stabilized the network. UK market powered ahead despite frustrations with coverage and network outages. The Sunday Times motoring correspondent, I always remember reading this one weekend, put it, first of all, mobiles were a novelty. Then there was the frustration when the call dropped out. We all experience that still, but never mind. But then it becomes a way of life. And so it, I think, has remained. This was the coverage that Cellnet had achieved by mid-1986. That's quite extensive. During 1985, the DTI and Raquel agreed that they needed to be part of the GSM plan. GSM was to be a digital standard and involved a huge amount of work on all fronts. Resources had been scarce until in 1986, something which I think is a wonderful name, but is part of the SEPT concept, a permanent nucleus was established of professional engineers with staff seconded from European telecoms operators. And I'm very proud to have seconded a key member of my team, and now their team, a chap called Bernard Malinder, who'd been the founding technical director at Cellular, to help with the work that needed to be done. So that progress on the technical standards started to be made at a pace. Political agreement wasn't as important as technical agreement established in GSM, because as I said before, the standard was very much tied up with the different manufacturers backed by government saying we have an export opportunity here. In 1987, there was discussion between the UK, France, Germany, and Italy at a governmental level. And that led to a key four-party intergovernmental agreement to support the development of GSM. The standards work would be supported and research shared. And I'm proud to be a signatory of that agreement. And the last time I saw this, one of these was a display of it. It's in the Science Museum. The political accord was followed by European operators signing a memorandum of understanding on developing GSM in September of 1987. In 1988, the two operator per market model was adopted, as well as open interfaces between operators. The GSM specification was ready to go to manufacturers. The growth in the UK market prompted the UK government to look beyond 900 megahertz at that stage. So they were not only looking at cooperation, they were looking at what comes next. And requests were made for bands at 1800 megahertz to be made available for mobile telecommunications. The growth in the UK mobile market had been fast. And by March 1988, which is just over 3 years after the launch of the networks, there were 600,000 customers in the UK. When you think back when the two cellular operators launched, I think there were about 16,000 pre-cellular mobile units in the market. So we've gone from 16,000 to 600,000 in 3 years. 95% of the population was covered. Increasingly, customers were interested in handheld devices rather than just phones in cars. And this gave rise to the Personal Communications Initiative, the DTI, headed by Lord Young, which actually manifested itself in two ways. Something called Telepoint, which some of you may remember, which was a cordless phone solution for use in wide area, and PCN, or Personal Communications Networks, using 1800 megahertz frequencies, but the GSM standard. This was also a stimulus, the size of the phone, to people wanting handhelds that could slip in their pocket. And this, in 1989, this is pre-cellular, this is still the old analog system. This was the first flip phone that Motorola launched in 1989. It was really first pocket size that wouldn't put out, cause your clothes to bulge. I'm very sexist there, because my wife always complains mobile manufacturers never think about the needs of women who tend not to have pockets about their person. So this was Telepoint. Bids for a network, this is in the UK, for a public cordless telephone transmitter system were called for by the DTI. And this is the successful BT application, Phone Point. The idea was that there would be cordless receivers, transmitters installed with quite low power, mainly in towns and cities. And when you were near one, you could make calls. I don't think you could receive calls, if my memory serves me right, but you could make calls. It wasn't a success. Manufacturers could not produce devices which worked satisfactorily in the mobile environment. There was no handoff, so if you were walking with your phone, you would lose the call. It wouldn't hand off to the next Wi-Fi, or perhaps cordless, not Wi-Fi system. The networks, in the end of the day, were shut down after about 2 years. Also, of course, with the handheld cellular sets, there was strong competition there with something that would hand off, and you could use not just in city centres or thereabouts, but in a much wider area. Today, of course, the idea of Telepoint is fulfilled by public Wi-Fi, which is a useful adjunct to the intense use of cellular radio. The UK called for the first bids for PCN in 1989, and Mercury PCN, whose bid I led after leaving BT in 1989, was awarded a license along with Unitel and Microtel. Mercury was a subsidiary of Cable and Wireless and was partnered in the successful bid for a PCN license by Telefonica and Motorola. PCN needed more base sites for reasons I've already explained, because at 1800 megahertz, the signals travel less far than they do at 900. So it's good for towns and cities, but expensive for rural areas. That expense over time led to the operators merging. Mercury PCN merged with Unitel to become Mercury 1-to-1 at launch. The GSM digital standard had been hard to establish, but so was the challenge to manufacturers. Mercury PCN, where I was at the time as chief executive, found it difficult for handset manufacturers to commit. I offered one manufacturer an order for 1 million mobiles, just to see whether they make the investment in the development that was needed, and they turned it down. In Germany, the networks were ready to launch, but they had no handsets. As at the February 1991 GSM Congress in Cannes, these buttons were issued for calling for God to send mobiles. This is Mannesmann, who was one of the operators with a license. The network was ready to go. They didn't have any handsets. So it's not all a slam dunk. Anyway, all's well. The logjam for mobiles was broken in May 1991 when the technical issues for manufacturers was solved. The UK's Orbitel was the first to get regulatory approval, and Motorola launched its first GSM mobiles in September 1991. Nokia hit the market in November from nowhere and was soon a market leader. The next stage of the revolution brought a digital handset capable of developing in today's smartphones. The phone and the customer identity were separated with the SIM card. Text messaging was enabled, marking the beginning of the end for radio paging outside hospitals. The big market throughout Europe enabled volume manufacturers, which allowed prices to come down. Ownership was moving from the company to the individual. The development of GSM was being closely watched across the world. I was invited to Beijing, late 1988, to brief the Chinese, as the European standard was being challenged by one being developed in the US. They had to choose. And ultimately, they chose GSM. In 1992, I took a new role at Cable and Wireless. I was asked by the new chairman, Lord Young, to develop cable and wireless cellular interests across the world as GSM licenses came up for bidding, and they followed the US and the UK example of competitive supply. We had a number of successes. We won licenses or share of licenses in places like Australia, South Africa, shown here, that we put into the South African government, Germany, Bulgaria, and Colombia, as well as others. But then what? Well, I moved in 1993 to head up cable and wireless operations in the Caribbean, which was nice, Atlantic, Africa, the Middle East, and Pakistan, and left cable and wireless in 1995 to join Dr. now Sir Mo Ibrahim at Mobile Systems International, where I was Group Managing Director. He'd been the head of radio planning at Cellular from soon after we launched, and was really had a great responsibility for the planning of the most intensive network in London that we had at launch, even though we couldn't make a phone call on the day. Looking back, Cellular, I think, has been transformative. There are now more than 7 billion mobiles in the world. Smartphones have changed society. But of course, I always said this in 1984 when people talked about Big Brother. They all have an off switch. Thank you very much.
John, thank you for that. It's fascinating to listen to you going back in an era which I think, looking around the room, I think is well within the lifetime of everybody here. Can I invite questions in the room? And for those watching, if you want to ask questions, if you indicate that on the chat, then I will invite you to put your question. But perhaps there's a, yes. You go first. Yeah.
You talked, thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting and good to see what was going on. I was in the computer industry and you were developing mobiles. A particular thing that caught my ear was your mention of international cooperation and obviously talking about the penetration of mobile phones across different countries. But also standards and the development into the GSM standard and so on. But in computing, we had standards for communications, the ISO 7-layer model. Yeah. And I wondered at what point the use of the technology of mobile phones linked in with the ISO model.
I think that probably came after this period with the development, well, at the end of this period with the development, when the potential of mobiles as computing devices rather than means of making telephone calls took place.
So 1993?
At the beginning of the 90s,
Yeah.
that would have taken place because we certainly had the view in the late 80s, and there's something I've only got on an old video of VHS. I can't find a way of, when we looked at what your phone could do, we used a model of a flip phone, which would give you the sort of information you now have on your smartphone. And for that, and of course, the other great thing is what happened in the 90s and the 2000s, I suppose, is it's an interesting challenge for mobile operators, is that the value generated in the network moved from the network provision, where there was pent-up demand, to people like Apple, who I think monetized it incredibly well, where you bought apps which ran on your mobile, which was entirely transparent to the network, both the internet and also the communications networks. They got that money. So cellular became a transport network for computing capability. And with, as mentioned, Moore's law, and it became easier for the customer to be able to access things, as we do now. You don't think about it, you just tap on, and that's all you get. But that was a deep integration that took place later between what was happening with the internet and computing, let's call it that, and the mobile communication systems.
Thank you.
There's an interesting thought about changeover from the pager to the cellular phone. In 86, 87, I was looking at public transport as a theme for, in fact, for a television program, which we never got to make. But one of the things was that they started introducing information screens on bus stops. And they had 3 pilot schemes, one in Piraeus, one in Frankfurt, and one in Southampton. And I got to look at the one in Southampton. But it was actually very interesting because they were using pager circuits which were dropping out of use because of the rise of cellular to send the information to a scrolling screen at each bus stop.
That's right.
And that I thought was, it was quite significant. The other thing, of course, is that I think if you go to Lancaster railway station, there is still a telepoint sign screwed onto the wall. And in Cloth Fair in London, until they refurbished it very, very late on, there was still a waffle radio aerial for Rabbit on the Hand and Shears pub. So these things have, sort of had a much wider context than just the private individual use.
In 1986, I was also responsible for the radio paging network. And what we found then was we had the first, you remember pagers went from, they sent you messages as well as going beep. We developed alphanumeric. And we were developing alphanumeric with a small feedback capability. We only had, they're very, very thin, very, very small data streams. And using them for bus timetables and other things like that was one of the things we were trying to develop, because we had the largest national radio paging network in the world.
And you could see it going over the edge of a cliff. Yes.
So how do we keep the handle turning? Such is life.
Is it still true that people like the RNLI still rely on pages rather than text, because text can get held up, being a computer buffered thing, whereas a pager, when you hit the transmit, it goes out. If you want to launch a lifeboat, you don't want to get the message tomorrow.
They may do, I don't know. I know they're still in use in hospitals.
Right, because I know that,
If you need somebody quickly,
yeah,
they tend to be, they're not wide area systems, they're within.
yeah, but I know that the lifeboats and mountain rescue, the things that needed to get there now, couldn't rely on
They know what
text.
that means if it goes off.
I think that they do use pages because basically all they need is an instant sound. They know where they're going.
Yeah.
The message is the sound, get to the lifeboat station or
They're
whatever.
cheap.
Certainly they were using them in Cornwall as recently as a year ago.
They are for the,
Private network.
Tony Davis has a question. Tony, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, good, Tony.
Okay, well, I did type it out, but just to repeat it, that I remember that around about 1990, there were a lot of people who were claiming and making what I believe were bogus claims that all these mobile phones and mobile phone networks in particular represented some sort of hidden biological hazard, and therefore they should be not anywhere near where there are children or schools or anything like that. I think there's still some opposition to having a mobile phone mast just near a school. I just wondered if you had any comments on that era when I think now people are not so fussed about it. They've just got used to the fact that mobile phones have evolved in the way that Darwin said that live things evolve, the trees and plants and animals evolve, survival of the fittest, and that's exactly what mobile phones do.
No, I think that it happened, as you say, in the early 90s. There was a number of scares of what would it's microwave radiation. What would it do to your brain? What would it do to children's brains?
Yes, exactly.
And a lot of work was done with us in the 80s by Motorola to look at this, and then later on a pan-European and beyond stage in the 90s with GSM. And the key matter, as I said, well, let me say, there were no harm was found. And now we've got 40 years experience. I still think that's the case, that there doesn't seem to be a build-up. But it is important, as I said during the presentation, the power output of these devices has to be carefully managed. You can't have hundreds of watts beaming into your ear. That's why building a mobile network for handheld portables was so important and quite difficult because of the size of the cells that were required. And it's true today. But the outputs are measured in microwatts, and so therefore the potential damage. I do remember, just as a bit of an anecdote, which I'm sure break the train a bit, but I'm sorry. In 1992 or 1992, one of these scares came up, and we did some work. We looked at all the work, and I found in the working group that I chaired that actually, for certainly using an electric razor was probably dodgier. So I actually went back to wet shaving then, because of the field that's generated by the motor in the electric. Not something that necessarily bothers yourself.
There are far better solutions.
Oh, yes, the pursuit of
Safety first.
And wet shaving actually does a much better job, doesn't it? No question.
yes.
Or you can grow a beard, although I don't fancy that myself.
There's a question, Jay Terry asks, what are your thoughts on 2G outlasting 3G?
I think ultimately it's a question of, we're back to, what does this computer in your pocket demand? And I think that some of it's being tested at 4G now, never mind 2G or 3G. You need to move on in order to get the efficiencies from the latest technology, the latest chips and so on and so forth. And we're working on 5G now in order to, and it's about computing. It's not necessarily, it's not just about mobile, not about mobile telecommunications. It's about what you need in order to fulfill most of the things you can, well, all the things that you can do on a desktop or a pad in your pocket. Well, most pads are networked now with cellular systems.
Isn't 2G used for tracking cars and vehicles and being stolen? Because it's only location information.
I must admit, I don't know. I would only say it's a question of the frequencies. The gold dust in all of this is frequencies. And that's why, of course, as well as 1800, they've gone to 2400, and they're looking at 2800 now. And indeed, 20 years ago, the Germans were looking at much higher levels, which are clean. The problem is that the lower down the frequency range you get, and I gave some examples of that with the 800, you've actually got a lot of people who want those frequencies. So it was just fortuitous that the government was able to strong arm the military to give up frequencies, and 405 line television had come out of use. But you know, they are the really finite limitation on mobile capacity, apart from getting smaller and smaller cells, microcells.
What's the
general size of a cell now compared to when things kicked off initially?
Well, I think probably the ones in, when we opened in 1985, we had 25 cells in London, mainly within the North Circular, which were capable of supporting the old Motorola equivalent of this. I should think there's probably, I don't know, 10,000, 15, 20,000 cells in that period, in that area now. And there, places like this would be full of them. Of course, the other adjunct to that is the comment I made on the fact that Telepoint didn't work, but you'd be surprised how much of the time you spend making mobile calls on your hand portable over a Wi-Fi network. Certainly, it was the operators worked up to the fact that if you're sitting in a room and you have Wi-Fi coverage, they can connect to you much better through that than they can through the wide area network. So the two of them have come together, and of course, it gives you much more. It gives you higher capacity as well, because it's not over the radio part. Well, there's only a small link over the radio part.
Yeah.
Sorry to come back again. A question about frequency. I used to be IT manager with Dictaphone International, and our engineers preferred 900 megahertz rather than 1800 because of their locations that they had to work in, like basements and places where switches were quite heavily involved because of the better reception with 900 megahertz. So they chose Vodafone and O2 that used 900 megahertz. Is that still true?
Well, 900 is still used, but so are other frequencies as well. I mean, both Vodafone and O2 have access to, as they've been launched, to the 1800 and 2400. Probably also. No, I think you're right. I mean, my feeling has always been, as we knew that the intelligence in handsets are able to hop between frequencies, economic logic is to actually use a variety of frequencies depending upon where you are. So to have 450 or out in the wilds where there's population density of 3 per square mile, 1800 or 2400 is an expensive way of serving those people. But 450, or what I didn't say is the old system 4 operated at 120 megahertz. And so actually having frequencies which suit the environment and your phone recognizing, which it can do, that you operate between them, actually would make it, would help with the economy of building networks. I said when 1900 was launched, having been in there, I saw the reaction by the various boards of suddenly saying, well, in order to get the same coverage as the 900 networks, you need to spend this much because you need 2 or 3 times as many cells. And I said, the bridge too far. That's when you got the mergers, and they're still taking place. So I think it's there is something to be said for looking at appropriate use of frequencies, but the licensing system is probably means that can't happen. Yes, please.
Thank you.
Just an observation on GPO telephones or whatever we might go back to. There always seemed to be a reluctance within the state body to accept new technology at a marketing level. Was there any indication that this was something which either led to the competitive tendering or actually waited for the political will to have competitive tendering rather than rolling out a national-based system, government monopoly?
I think it was. I don't think so. The GPO and the Post Office was an interesting body. Having worked, when I actually joined, it was a GPO, I was a civil servant for 2 years, which is quite amazing. But it had been quite innovative. If you look back at the 30s with the things they did to promote telephone usage until there became a shortage, the marketing was very good. And they employed, you remember the GPO film unit, John Grierson, did things for telephone. Everyone remembers it for the night mail and Benjamin Britten and W.H. Auden, but they did things for telephones as well. And that continued through after the war, subject to the restrictions. I think there was a bit of a setback, however, on the technical side, in as much as, so I'm told, this is before my time, you know, GPO tried to go digital in the, I think the 50s or in the 60s.
Highgate Wood.
Highgate Wood.
Yeah, full.
And people who don't know, they did it with valves rather than transistors. And one guy I knew said that we always knew when they were testing the exchange around Highgate, because when they switched it on, all the street lights dimmed. Now, I think that actually had a consequence, which manifested itself in the switches that came together, and you know that's why they were a bit late getting off the mark with digital. But I think if they had the offering, they were also much bound by government. Anyone who worked, and I worked at the centre for a time in the 70s, working for the chairman at that time, and you couldn't move without government permission, so it became increasingly difficult. I don't think you know, there is a tradition of innovation, but you know, some bad experiences.
Question over there.
I used to work for our NEC during the period which you've mentioned, and it's very interesting to note that technological progress not every manufacturer could keep up. NEC was one of the market leaders against Motorola at the time, but when GSM came along, although they were the biggest manufacturer of semiconductors in the world, they couldn't do the digital signal processing. And in fact, I was based in Camden Town, and they opened up a branch in Reading, and they hired a dozen British digital signal, there would be computer programmers at that time, but that failed, and NEC dropped out of the market altogether. And just amazing how one moment you can be big. Nokia was huge, dropped out of the market. Now with Panasonic, we have phones, they disappeared. It's just very strange that even some companies with all those resources just don't have enough. And I went to a talk this week about what's happening in Taiwan, and TSM, the people who manufacture the chips for iPhones, is the only company in the world that can do most of the big things. And what's going to happen tomorrow when the Chinese get problematic? Nobody knows. But another talk I went to was somebody from Schlumberger. He was talking about test equipment, and he was telling us that the technical step up from TACS to GSM was huge, and it was mind-boggling. And then when it went on to the higher levels, he said it's even more mind-boggling. And it's hardly anybody seemed to have a total grasp, because TACS, I remember the spec for TACS, I've got it, it was a sort of A4 this big. The specs for GSM was about 10 large volumes, if I remember rightly. So
I remember sending it to the Chinese because they didn't have any. We sent a parcel. You're right. I think it's interesting. I mean, Motorola, who actually invented the mobile telephone for use during US troops in the war. And they were this big and huge things, but they weren't. And they were the leaders in the market for years, but they went. So it's an interesting and, as you say, technically incredibly challenging. And I remember going to visit NEC at their brand new headquarters in Tokyo to try and get them to
we were trying
to come into GSM, and they couldn't do it.
We were doing testing in Regent's Park, and the guys came over, but it was a very primitive kind of test at that time. It was basically almost like proof of concept rather than any kind of development. So I think that was about 1990s. So I could quite see why they wouldn't be able to produce 1 million by next week.
Yes.
Just a quick one. You mentioned the word Rabbit, and I was going to ask anyway, where did Rabbit fit into this? Were they a reseller for Telepoint or something like that? I mean, given there was government control over all these things, the operators, or were they something that sneak in sideways?
As I recall, Rabbit was a totally separate concept.
Well, they were allowed to do it,
A
yes.
radio-based, oh, no, Rabbit.
It was Hutchinson's.
Which wasn't it?
Hutchinson's. It's the equivalent to your Telepoint, but
That's right.
I wonder whether it was a resold Telepoint or whether the government actually allowed another one to.
No, there were several licenses issued, I think.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah.
For
That specific thing, yeah.
for Telepoint, yeah.
Yeah.
I can't remember how many now. But that's right, Rabbit was one of them.
and wasn't Rabbit, when you went home, you then had just a cordless phone at home?
That's right, yeah. It worked off of that. And it was, I say, it just, unfortunately, they weren't able to make it. Well, in hindsight, it was too late to the.
Overtaken by technology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To walk around the streets looking for rabbit signs, picking on the building.
I think, John, at that point, perhaps we might conclude. As far as I can see, there are no further questions online.
Yes, I do have a question online.
Oh, I do. I'm sorry. Yes, I beg your pardon. I didn't pick up a hand. I think you had your hand up and I didn't see it. I'm sorry. Yes, away you go.
Yes, I just wanted to ask about the sell-off of Cellnet by BT. I mean, it did seem to me at the time that seemed to be a mad idea, because the future seemed to be cellular rather than fixed landlines. And there was BT selling off Cellnet. So I wondered whether you thought that was a terrible mistake, and were you in a position to do anything to stop that happening at the time, or?
I'd already left and gone to work for Cable and Wireless. I think whatever I say will incriminate me, so I thought it was madness. It was BT at that time responding to the city, who said, you've got this asset within your portfolio, because by then BT had bought out Securicore and were 100% owners of Cellnet. So it became BT Cellnet. And they forced them, they encouraged BT to, as you remember, to split out Cellnet, and it became an independent, a quoted company, and was promptly bought by Telefonica. And 20 years later, I suppose BT bought EE. I think it was strategically a mistake.
I did actually have another rather different question, and that was about the time when when the different national champions were trying to introduce their own standards, and the one that prevailed in the end, as you said was Cellnet, was GSM, and that seems to me to be rather similar to the situation where the UK was trying to promote their own internet standards based on the 7-layer model and OSI and all the rest of it, and that too was a complete failure. It does seem to have been your story seems to have been slightly more successful in that there did come to be a realization that trying to promote national champions was a mistake, whereas the realization that the national champion in the OSI world was a mistake never really came about. They just had to give up because nobody used it.
Well, I best comment just on Cellular. What I said, I thought it was a tremendous example of what you can do without stultifying competition with international cooperation. I think it was excellent. We would not have had the growth in the market that we had. And I think it's outstanding today. You know, you've got well, it's over 7.4 billion people in the world. It's completely bypassed the fixed network in places like Africa and the Middle East. And I remember when we saw that potential in South Africa when I was there. And in China, I mean, when I first went to China, they didn't know where half the lines went out of Beijing. No idea. And the coverage was tiny. I mean, they're just roaring ahead now. So that you don't need to build a fixed network in order to have effective telecommunications or, computing. So it was, for me, it was good, and it was unusual, national differences. I mean, still there was an interest in promoting industry, but the national differences were put to one side. And I remember Geoffrey Patty, who was the Minister of State who signed the quadripartite, and I think later became chairman of Plessy, and said to me he thought it was the best thing he'd ever done in politics. So I think there was a realisation it was positive.
Was GSM based on any of the national standards, or did it take a bit from each, or was it just complete ab initio?
No, because the national standards were very much analog. You had in Germany it was a 450 system, and they had one export market, which was to South Africa, and France had a system that was also, I think, at 450, which they were trying to develop and sell. But they weren't digital. They hoped to be digital, and the work between 1982 and 1986 was still, once the Accord started, was very much aimed at trying to get some national advantage for a manufacturer, which it didn't work because the market itself, by then, the market demand was seen to be there. And this, working at this pace was actually going to cause more problems than it solved. So I think it was wonderful that we came together, put this team together in, I think it was in Nice or south of France, the permanent nucleus, and they did a fantastic job, supported by the national, they were still largely monopolies then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, John, thank you for that. Just a couple of quick announcements. We heard the sad news that Charles Lindsay passed away very recently. You will have seen on the chat that there are the details of his funeral. So if you look in the chat, if you are wishing to go, the details are there. Can I apologise? We have had a flicker on the one of the screens that's been displayed. I have to explain that the BCS upgraded its technology, and the engineers were here at about 10:30 this morning, and when we arrived at about 12 o'clock, they said completed the work. When we fired the system up shortly at 2 o'clock before the meeting, we discovered the flicker, but apparently the chief technician who was here was of the view that he knew what the problem was, but he would have to reboot the system, which he didn't think was a good idea in the half hour before the meeting started. So apologies for the flicker. It wasn't fixable within the time that was available. The next meetings, very quickly, next time, Arthur Dransfield, that's a familiar name, talking about programming an ICT 1900. In April, somebody called Roger Johnson, I don't know, anyway, is going to talk about Kathleen Booth, the widow of Andrew Booth, partner in so many of those projects in the very early days, one of the very last pioneers from the 1940s to have been with us and who died in September. And then Tony Davis, again, another familiar face, will be talking in May about the story of the QR code. So those are the next 3 meetings. Train strikes and other things permitting, those will all be hybrid meetings. So there will be an opportunity for you, if you wish, to come and meet old friends here at the BCS. We've had about 24 people here today. It would be nice to see a few more, but we had just over 80 online today. So we will welcome all of you to the next meetings. And can I conclude by thanking John Carrington? I think the number of questions and the range of questions demonstrated the interest in this topic. We don't often deal with communications. John and I were discussing beforehand how critical communications are to modern technology for both computer communications and human communications more generally. And it seemed appropriate, therefore, for today to look back to the early days of the mobile, what became the mobile phone, and really is now that device that we all have in our pockets. None have gone off during this meeting, so everybody was in flight mode, or you've left them at home, but whatever. But John, it was a fascinating tour to be taken back in a period that are within all of our lifetimes, and really to see the speed of the change, and in a way, and a successful, by and large, a successful evolution. So many of the stories that we hear in the history of computing, there are dead ends and dinosaurs and so on, which provide interesting talks, but also warn us that it's very easy to go up a blind alley. But thank you for today, a fascinating talk, and I look forward to seeing everybody next month. John, thank you very much.